on to our very first panel of day 2. It's around how we can engage leadership, particularly in very complex business settings, to adopt and to put in place design thinking principles. And with me on the stage are 3 incredible individuals who are not only working for complex structures, but have successfully integrated design thinking principles onto their business sectors. Closest to me is Sam Yen. He is with JP Morgan Chase and Company. Jeanett Modise is an HR executive and a business coach, and Paul Steenkamp is with Jack Frost. Hello, everybody, and welcome.
Africa.
You traveled all the way from California to come and join us here.
I did.
Dare we ask how long it took you and how far you went?
It wasn't too bad. So I flew to Frankfurt, spent some time in Frankfurt, and then came to Cape Town directly.
Are there design thinking principles that could be applied to make that trip shorter?
Yeah. I think I was telling somebody, like, the key is to be able to sleep whenever you can.
Indeed. How did you successfully managed to introduce design thinking into JP Morgan Chase & Co?
I think, well, let me take a pause first and give a little background. I first wanted to say, like, I'm so honored to be here because I feel so privileged to be a witness over many, many years in terms of the emergence of design thinking. It's just amazing. Like, it's a global phenomenon now. And in terms of being a witness of, being able to cross paths with people like Bernie Roth, my professor at Stanford, Larry Leifer. I was studying design before there was a D school, believe it or not, right? And then the emergence of the D school with, running into George and Uli and Richard, and seeing kind of that spread. So I just feel really honored to see that grow. And I think my niche, I think, out of all of this stuff is not just learning about the principles and the mindsets of design thinking. In some sense, that comes pretty naturally, right? It's common sense when you think about it and you learn it, and it's what we do naturally to some extent. It's very unnatural the way kind of we approach problem solving and finding the right problems to solve in a large organization. So navigating that large organization, I think, is really kind of the area, my niche, if you will, over time, because I spent 14 years at SAP. You heard Hasso, really passionate about that. If you think about the chairman, the founder of a company, you would think that would be able to go right down the organization, no problems, lots of problems. Right? It was a 10-year journey. So I think all of those lessons learned, we could talk about some of those later. How to navigate a large organization, how to get change to happen. It was less about knowing design thinking and becoming an expert at design thinking, but more about persuading other people, influencing other people, pushing, learning from your setbacks to be able to push forward and slowly transform an organization. I think that's what really helped at JP Morgan.
And Jeanett, in your space as an HR executive and a business coach, you would have to help organizations realize a new way of thinking. And I imagine you've come across some wonderful challenges in your wonderful history in this space.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Africa. Yes, I have come across wonderful challenges. In the examples I could give where I actually got involved with design thinking was when I was HR director for SAP in Africa. I had the privilege of working for an organization that was forward thinking on design thinking, but also not looking at design thinking from a sales perspective or just a business perspective. The one common thread in every business is people. My view is that people are the business. The people make or break the business. And that's where my agenda comes in. It's about how do I partner with the business to ensure the culture evolves in such a way that it can enable us to achieve and even exceed our expectations, but also to take the people along and to look at our stakeholders holistically, create the right environment where people can thrive, but also understand you cannot define or solve any problem for anybody unless you involve them. And in this world where everything is so fluid, there's so much complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity, design thinking is perfect, but you need to build it into, the context of the business. And that's part of my agenda, using design thinking as a vehicle. And I've done that with SAP and also with Sanlam, and we'll talk about the detail a little bit later on how I went about that. Thank you.
If I'm a shareholder or a director of the company where I need to be able to predict what my future profits are going to be, the minute you start thinking about ambiguity and sitting actually with the discomfort of not knowing what the outcome of the process is going to, that's a lot to ask. That's a paradigm shift of note, isn't it?
Certainly it is. And we've seen a lot of that in the past 2.5 years, because that's what all businesses were working with. No one had seen the pandemic. No one knew what the impact of the pandemic would have been, as an example. But we all have to do it, and do it even when we are afraid. We all have to find a way to be iterative, to refine, to be vulnerable enough to listen to each other, but also to ensure that we are defining the problems right and solving for the right problems.
Indeed. Paul, how did you get into this space, and how are you applying it in your organization?
Thanks, Africa. I'm not sure if is my mic working?
Yeah.
It is. Okay. First of all, I also want to say it's really wonderful to be here. So many friends and friends I haven't yet met. I have felt like a lonely tree many years ago in this space, operating out of Cape Town, and it feels like the forest is emerging, and it's just absolutely amazing. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. Africa, my mom has never been thrilled about my career choices. I've chosen a road less traveled. But the fact that I'm on a stage with you, I think is going to make her incredibly happy. And I think
hello, Mom.
Yeah, she's going to finally have something to tell her friends about. So I grew up as a young boy fascinated that many of the adults that I encountered really didn't enjoy their jobs and were often moaning about work. And I thought, well, you spend so much time there. I became interested curious about how to improve people's experiences at work, and from a very young age. In my 20s, I was handed a copy of a book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, and it's a book in creative recovery and discovery. It really changed my life, and a sort of a Venn diagram appeared for me, which was how to help innovators thrive in the workplace. And so that's how I've come to this work. I first encountered design thinking in 2013. We were lucky enough, I was working at F&B at the time. We had a trainer come out from California. It was wonderful. And then in 2014, I was lucky enough to go to an immersion in San Francisco and actually go into organizations where you could feel the heartbeat of design thinking living. And over time, I've just realized it's a really great way to be helpful and to do work that matters.
And in 2013, when you were being introduced to the concept and seeing, I imagine you did, the vision, you obviously bought into it. Talk to us about some of the challenges you encountered in trying to bring more people on the journey with you.
Yeah, I think just to build on some of the comments, it absolutely helps to have a flag carrier, a very senior person in the organization who's willing to walk a very long road. So a very gritty individual who believes that innovation is important for, creating a more effective society and serving people better, and is willing to navigate not only the ambiguity, but often the ups and downs of this kind of journey. So having that leadership support, if you don't have it, it's a very tough thing. I also think that legitimizing innovation as part of a strategy is important, and linking executive remuneration to innovation-related outcomes helps a lot, because there is the short-term mindset that is driven a lot by quarterly reporting and or what the analysts are expecting. That's a big killer of innovations that are in a discovery-driven kind of scenario, still figuring things out. They often get shut down prematurely when there's pressure in the business around costs and or moving people off innovation projects into more revenue-generating projects. So, linking executive remuneration to a portfolio of innovations, some on a near-term horizon and some on a sort of 2 to 3 or even 5-year horizon does help legitimize things. There's a lot of other things to talk about. I think organizational structure plays a big part in more federated organizations where there is a more entrepreneurial culture. It's easier to embed things like this. But it's also useful to start with early adopters, people who want to change and do things differently. And I think it was Jean was talking about people who've tried lots of other things. We kind of call them can-doers. They really have this optimistic can-do attitude, and they're willing to try new things without giving up too soon. And it's important to figure out who they are and partner with them to pilot and get some runs on the board.
Yeah, for sure. I want us now to look at some of the practical applications, both from a sense of this was the challenge that the organization was facing. This is how we applied design thinking to obviously come up with solutions, and the application of those solutions actually realized what the objective was, as well as, you said earlier, it doesn't help sometimes having the leader buying into it when you've got a bureaucratic structure of, 25,000 people that are just refusing to move in the same direction. Yeah. Let me start with you, Sam.
Yeah, okay. So I think the first thing that's important in large-scale organizations, right, is being able to articulate what is the value proposition, right? You got to speak in the language in which kind of the business, I think all of us kind of operate in a business organization, appreciates and understands, right? And Paul talked a lot about innovation. If I were to poll everybody in this room and say, what's your definition of innovation, right? Everybody's going to have lots of different definitions. So one little, I think we're going to just try to give tips and tricks that's worked for us. One definition that I've just kind of made up and is like this equation of innovation where it's partly creativity, but it's also partly execution, right? And if you think about it, it's a combination of both, right? So how many people in the room think of themselves, this is like going to be completely different from when you talk to a business audience, but how many people would see themselves as creative people, right? Raise your hands. Like it's almost the whole entire room. How many people think that you're really, really experts at execution? Raise your hand. Right? This is opposite of like every other kind of when you go into a large organization. But the key is you can't have, if you want true innovation, you can't have one without the other. It's a combination of the two. And realistically, if you go into large scale organizations, you're going to get everybody raising their hands saying it's all, I'm all about execution because number one, their bosses are probably in the room and that's what they're judged on. And then number two, like if you ask people like, okay, are you individually creative people? It's very sad. Like, not a lot of people have the confidence to raise their hands, right? Creative confidence. But then if you ask the follow-up question, if you feel creatively confident as an individual, do you feel that you have the skills necessary to bring that creativity across your entire organization? And almost everybody puts their hands down, right? So if people, like you were nodding your head, innovation is creativity and execution, but most organizations lack the ability to bring that creativity part of the equation across their entire organization. There's a need there, right? And it's a very logical argument, but this is what you need in large organizations. Then I start to see executives kind of nod their head. And then that's where you introduce, this is where design thinking can help. Because design thinking is a methodology. You can systematically even, bring that kind of way where you could bring creativity across your organization. And then creativity is also like a very, very charged and challenging word, right? Because people don't feel confident in terms of creativity. But one way you could just talk about that is, execution is really about your effectiveness as an organization at solving problems, right? And you've got KPIs and processes and all of, Six Sigma, all of that stuff. And it's all about effectiveness in solving problems. But creativity is finding new ideas, understanding that the problems that you were solving that made you successful as an organization in the past are not the same problems that are going to take you into the future. So if you think of execution as problem solving, you could think of creativity as finding the right problem to solve, with the new context. Bertie mentioned this as need finding. This was one of the core tenets originally of design thinking. So, introducing, hey, you need creativity. There's a skill that the organization needs in terms of finding the right problem to solve. That's usually, how I at least introduce it, and that's usually kind of at least getting the executives to get the initial buy-in because it makes logical sense.
Just reflecting for a moment on some of the conversations yesterday, two things sort of jumped to mind. JP Morgan Chase and Company is a multinational organization. How do you manage the language situation there. And then yesterday afternoon, there were a lot of reflections around the issue of trust, where you get the right people into the room, all well and good, but how do they trust the process, that their voices are going to be heard and that actually the process is going to realize what the objective is?
I would say JP Morgan is probably more US centered than SAP, so I'm going to use the SAP example.
Fantastic,
more. But yeah, it's very difficult. And I think the people on the stage yesterday were probably more qualified than I am to talk about kind of taking this notion of design thinking, which I think the highest level notion of design thinking, finding the right problem to solve before solving the problem, different ways of solving the problem, that's common sense, right? But how you practice that in different cultures was very different. Like, so we had cultural training, between, how do you bring and do brainstorming sessions in, Asian cultures where hierarchy is very important. When you have Israeli, German people kind of mixed with, people from China, people from India, and how do you kind of get elicit ideas from people that tend to be kind of more reserved, tend to be, I think design thinking has been sometimes criticized as, this is good for people that are extroverts, but how do you get introverts to be able to contribute to the conversation? So, doing some sort of that level setting before you get into these exercises sometimes is helpful.
No, for sure. Jeanett, back to the previous question of how you can share practical applications of design thinking in the organizations where you've used it as an intervention.
I think just to tap on what Sam mentioned earlier on, context is very important. So that when introducing design thinking, the focus is not on the tool. The business strategy in a complex organization and the culture, they help you to create the foundation where everyone else has a common understanding of what is it that you want to do and defining the culture that you want to achieve. I'll give an example of my experience in Sanlam at a stage where in 2020 we had new group chief executive, new business strategy, well-refined business strategy, new chairman of the board, a few new ExCo members, and then we had the pandemic. We had to amplify collaboration, synergies across the business. We were also dealing with an environment that we were also experiencing for the first time around the pandemic. And we were vulnerable as leaders. One of the things that we agreed on was to say, yes, we understand the commercial strategy, but without ensuring that we move the culture and then we amplify our execution. Like you said, its execution is very important. People were overwhelmed, lots to do. And when you introduce design thinking, you also don't want it to be like an extra thing. It's a vehicle that should help you to execute better, to work smarter, faster, and solve for the right problems and be flexible, which is what we needed most in that environment. And what we did was to target senior leaders, because we realized that leaders are very, very important in evolving the organization. And we knew what had brought us to where we were would not help us to succeed in a different environment. And instead of adding on extra things, we put in place a program. We had about 530 senior leaders from 35 countries participating in a strategic agility program. We partnered with Duke, and we used design thinking and Modise Loop as a tool. About 120 people were split in various work streams that were working on business challenges that were already identified in the strategies. So they already had the burden of anything extra off their shoulders. It was helping them to define those problems and come up with solutions, which meant they were able to execute better and faster. It was diverse teams of people. Each one of them just got like 2 sentences. What the theme is about, like to give you an example, we said we are in the new ways of work. We need to find a way. How are we going to work? Find a framework and come up with an approach that will help us as an organization from from the people, the systems, and the solutions we provide in such a way that we can be able to thrive and navigate this challenging environment. We had one around the values, and we had one about cost optimization, and how do we disrupt ourselves. And I remember we had groups of about 20 to 25 people, and initially, as they were going through the coaching to build the capability, because that is important to help the people to understand what is design thinking, and to have someone facilitating and taking them by hand so that they can apply it in a context that they understand, not something theoretical. And the focus should not be on design thinking. It's the application that becomes important. Initially, the people were saying it's complex, it's taking too long, we feel like we're going round in circles. But with the support of building the capability, building the skill, and having coaching and support, by the time they got to the third sessions, they got the hang of it. And we ended up with teams that had come up with proposals which were going to EXCO and the board, real serious proposals. Some were like designing a technology solution for our business to address the corporate clients in the employee benefits division. And those proposals were all approved by EXCO. Some were tested, the results have come out, the values were approved, we started to integrate them in the organization, but we gave the teams the opportunity to think and start afresh, not to tweak things. We gave them the space to think. And secondly, because it was addressing the priorities they already had, it was not anything extra. There was already the burning platform. It made sense for them to do it. They saw the value in terms of the outcome, helping them to deliver, and execution was ramping up, and it was addressing the business needs. We also had executive sponsors. Paul mentioned it's important to have people at a very senior level that are advocates and ambassadors for design thinking, not for the sake of it, but because you know something happens when you use design thinking in a very, very practical way. And each of those work streams were sponsored by 2 executives. And it takes a lot to be a sponsor for design thinking when you are building the practice and you're building that as a way of working. For instance, I had to sit in some of the sessions and resist and also hold back not to give the answers all the time. Because there's a reason why you have diverse team of people. They bring some experiences, they bring knowledge, they bring skills, and they see things from different perspectives. And when you do that, you're not losing any opportunities for the business. So it really, really helped us to navigate the pandemic, and we're implementing some of those things even now.
That's a phenomenal achievement. For those who are not from South Africa, Sanlam is probably one of the most conservative companies you will ever come across. Successful, don't get me wrong, and there is success in the model that they've used for senior leadership to adopt this and actually implement it to a point of success. Really phenomenal. So well done to you and your team for bringing it to them and for achieving the success that you have. How do you top that, Paul?
No, but I think maybe it's an opportunity. I really enjoyed yesterday afternoon sessions because I thought it was important that we don't get stuck in an echo chamber about a methodology or a practice, and that we challenge each other in a healthy and constructive way. I think that personally we haven't spent enough time talking about the people element associated with this practice or process. So I'm so glad that psychological safety and trust have come up as key themes. I think a credible leader convening a design thinking session already has some trust in the bank with the people that are arriving, but it's also important that the methodology is well considered and well designed in terms of the process that you take people on. So there are a lot of moving parts, and I think that the people side is very important. I've witnessed and been part of, teams of great people with terrible process still have excellent outcomes. And the opposite is true. Terrible people, great process, you still have a terrible outcome. So, making sure that the profile of the people is complementary, but also that they've opted in, they want to be there. And I like this hack about, it should be helping them do more meaningful work and work that matters. And I think everyone wants to be helpful. I think it's key to a happy life, is you want to serve and be helpful. And I think this methodology for people who are that way inclined is a godsend, but convening the right people is also as important.
No, for sure. Let's now talk about some of the hardest challenges each of you had to overcome in adopting this process for the organizations. What were some of those hard challenges at SAP when you were adopting design thinking?
I think, how many people are trying to influence and impact a large organization with design thinking, right? A lot of people, right? I think one of the most difficult challenges is setting the right expectations, right? It's not going to happen overnight, right? SAP was like 100,000 people when I left. JP Morgan is almost 300,000 people. The problem is an executive will come to a D-School executive ed class or something like that. They get so excited, and then they will say, Paul, you've been effective at leading these projects. You're the person. You're going to transform the entire culture of our organization. And I want it to happen as quickly as you can, right? Does that sound familiar? Yeah, I think because of some of the experience at SAP, and then I know in the next session there's going to be some folks from design and business. There are networks of organizations that have similar challenges, and there's similar things that are successful, similar things that cause you to fail, and there's opportunities to learn from each other. So I would highly recommend, if you're not part of that kind of network, you have help. You don't have to feel like the lonely person within your organization. But I'm going to introduce just a short little framework that we talk about a little bit, just to kind of understand that it is a journey, and it's a long journey in a lot of cases, right? So the first phase is like, I was kind of talking about this feeling of loneliness. We call it the lonely soldier. You're the person assigned to transform the entire organization, and you feel very lonely. You need to, but through sheer determination, and because you have that executive partnership, you're able to get things done. But it's very, very difficult, right? Because you're fighting all that change yourself. You move into the next phase, which is you still have success, and you have more success because your first success, they say, okay, do this, do this, do this. We call it success in silos, right? So you're still able to kind of have a little bit more impact in different areas, but it's still a lot of work, right? You're still kind of fighting through every single time. You still depend on that executive sponsorship for you to be able to have that success. The third phase is, I think, the most important phase, where it becomes less of a push from up top and more of a pull from the organization, right? The businesses start to see that you're having success in these areas, and they're actually, instead of being pushed by the top to do it this way, they're actually asking you to help out. And that's like a tipping point. That's a very important part of an organizational transformation. But it's also very difficult because you're not really set up as an organization. You're a little bit bigger than your lonely soldier phase, but you're not set up to you're having success and everybody's asking you for help right now, and that's very, very difficult as well. And the fourth and final stage, maybe not the final stage because organizations go up and down all the time, but the next stage is really scaled, right? Where you've actually started to put the processes in place. You've started to hire the right people. You've started to incentivize people to have this kind of behavior. And that's just a framework that, as we talk to more and more people that are going through this journey, organizations seem to kind of go through this, state of readiness for design thinking, if you will.
Yeah. And for you, Jeanett?
I like the framework that Sam has used because it's a simple one and it applies in all organizations. And if I look at the Sanlam example, yes, there were, I think, 2 or 3 lonely soldiers. And I was one of the 2 or 3. In fact, the other one is in the room now. It's good to see you, Frederick. And I think we started with the lonely soldiers, and we had about 25 people that started with the advanced program in design thinking. But the question is, what do you do when you in an organization of about 40,000 people and you have only 25 people that have gone through the program and they go back into the business? The chances of success are very slim, and sometimes it's easy for the business to think you are the silver bullet because you've done this advanced program. And one of the things that we found was important was firstly us as the ambassadors to walk the talk. And like I did the program myself. The fact that I had exposure in SAP and I've used it in SAP while we were also transforming the business from an HR perspective, but broadly as an organization. When I got to Sanlam, I went through a program. I had to go through a shorter program and make sure that we get more people going through it and broaden the network of people that are participating in these programs, but also because the focus was not on the tool. The focus was more on integrating the design thinking principles in what we are doing. Even the people who had not gone on the program were getting the exposure indirectly. And when we got to a stage where I think we did the intensive program for about 4 or 5 years, and then when we got to a stage where we had 530 senior leaders going through a strategic agility journey to help us win as an organization, it was a deliberate approach to scale and to make sure that we create the language in the context of Sanlam and the understanding of what we wanted to achieve. When I reflect back on my experience in SAP, generally, SAP was initially known as an organization that was selling software. And there was this view that it's complex to do business with SAP. And we were at a stage where we wanted to simplify our business, and we were also transforming to become a cloud organization. And you cannot just transform the client-facing side of the business. Because when you look at the culture and you look at how you work and who you are as an organization, you need to be consistent. And if you are building a sustainable business, it has to start from the people, the culture, your processes, how you engage with all the clients, how you create value for all the clients. And an example that we had to do was, for every market unit, like Africa was a market unit, each of the execos, each of the executives had to make sure, when we say we want to make SAP easy to work with, how do I, from HR, make it easy for anybody in the organization to work with me? How do I work easier with someone who's in sales, someone who's in marketing, to an extent where we linked it to the purpose, we linked it to our values, because it has to be what we eat, we live, we breathe. You can't do it sometimes. And to give you an example, our sales teams would have goals, targets that they are working towards. And we changed. We said, we are solving business problems. But for whom? We need to know and understand the client better. Define the problem from the client's perspective. If you take an HR executive as an example in company X and we are in SAP, it was important for the SAP salespeople to engage with me as the HR executive, to help and partner with them, and the client, who is an HR executive, in defining an HR problem. That way you can come up with a solution to solve the right problem. And you can even show an example of how, as SAP, you use SAP. And we use design thinking principles in doing that. And it actually helped us to transform into a cloud organization, a business that was easier to do work with, in every area of the business, not just sales.
Yeah.
Paul? Line managers, they are the toughest nut to crack. I liked that yesterday, the notion of design thinking being associated with redistribution of power is absolutely true in complex organizations. In my experience, the execs think that they are the most, positionally and hierarchically, they think they have the most influence and power in an organization, but they really don't. the line manager community really determine and decide what actually is going to happen. Many of these people have spent 20, 30 years building a career to become a line manager, and really the line managers are custodians of the status quo. So anything that threatens the status quo is something that I think they would psychologically, from a safety perspective, feel threatened by. And so it's very important to engage them as early on as possible, figure out. So for example, one of the consequences of introducing these new ways of working is you would say, well, we have small multidisciplinary teams that are highly egalitarian. So, different people will take a lead in the team at different times depending on where we are in the process and what their capabilities are and insights are. But if I've been waiting 25 years to be the boss and be the smartest person in the room and tell everyone what to do, and now suddenly you're asking me to join a team and not do that, you can see why they might be resistant. And I'm obviously, for the sake of brevity, making some big generalizations here, but it's really, really important to bring the line manager community on the journey. Work with the early adopters in that community and the HR business partners, because ultimately you've got to legitimize this work and free up time for people to do it. And that becomes part of a contracting discussion that has to happen between the HR business partners and line. You've got to give express permission for this type of work to be done, or work to be done in this way. So you have to, once you've got a few runs on the board, you have to start embedding it in the systems of the organization, the HR practices. I've mentioned reward, for example. You can't do that at the start of a journey because you haven't earned the right to do it. But once you've gone through the first couple of phases that Sam's described, you now have a right to start showing up and you've got a little bit of collateral to negotiate with. And until you get to those systems, those practices, you're not going to really embed and scale the change. And so, yeah, that line manager community, don't underestimate them.
All right.
One quick follow-up.
Of course, yeah.
You were saying, people want to be the loudest voice in the room. It just reminded me, my colleague, Janaki Kumar, she's got a great line for that. She says, would you like to be the loudest voice in the room, or would you like the customer to be the loudest voice in the room? Right?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So some practical applications and examples of how implementing design thinking processes in large organizations has resulted in some wonderful rewards, but also some of the challenges that had to be overcome. When Sam was asking how many of you are involved in this work, a few hands came up. We've got about 7 minutes left, so I'm handing it over to you now to fire away with some questions. And there's already a question up there, and there's a question, I've got 3 questions already. If I can get the microphone, please, let's start with the ladies. Sorry, George, we'll get to you.
Thank you. Gee, I'm rarely called a lady. Thank you, Africa. We've talked a lot about inclusion and engagement of a diverse group of stakeholders all day yesterday. And so this idea of the role of leaders not to be the smartest or the loudest, but to be conveners of conversations. I'm wondering what that would look like. And in your experience, leaders who take that on, how do they look different than our current models of leaders? I mean, what are their behaviors?
Who would you like to take that question for you? Anyone?
I'm happy to start. I think those leaders, firstly, they can recognize that they don't have to have all the answers themselves. There's a reason why they work in a team. It's because we complement each other. The leader has a role to facilitate, but they listen. It doesn't mean every suggestion is going to come up being implemented. But as a leader, if you don't listen, you're actually cheating yourself, you're cheating your team, and you're cheating the organization. And I think those leaders are also vulnerable enough to say, I can't do it alone. And it's the first experience, but they appreciate the value of collaboration, of synergies, of collective intelligence. And they create safety for people. because people need to be able to speak up. That psychological safety that Paul alluded to earlier on is very important when you have people in a team working with a leader. And the leader, they recognize the work that has been done by the people. Gone are the days when the leaders wanted to get the credit for everything. You need to make sure that you give the credit to the team. The team actually trumps the individual.
All right. There was a question right there, yeah.
Thanks very much. Just for context, I represent, so Zutari is a 2,500 strong engineering and advisory firm on the continent with a long journey of trying to see sort of design thinking as this fairy dust that engineers can bring to the world, not selling design thinking as a solution. It was a way to make our engineering and advisory services better. When I say we're engineers, we're not, it's just be fair, it's not industrial engineers. So it's important because I think for the room, we're not talking about people that are converted necessarily, but the impact is potentially huge. A lot of the frameworks and things I think are hugely valuable given the scars on our back and what we're trying to do. The question really has come down to us. We're thinking very clearly about almost monitoring and evaluation kind of questions about this idea of valuing the design process and how it, in a very technical world, where you are results driven and your clients are not necessarily identifying as creatives. How would you think, and Sam, maybe I'll aim this one at you, is thinking about just making it visible, this value that this process has brought so that you can start to kind of get that story changing?
Yeah, well, I mean, you heard, my longest experience was at SAP, and you heard Hasso talk about the engineering culture, right? Software engineering, but hardcore engineering, at the end of the day. I think it's really making sure that every person, no matter how deep down your engineering task is, has a vision of what you're trying to do for the customer, right? And I think sometimes, you could say that and it might not have enough of an impact. But one of the tricks up your sleeve is, sometimes because you're part of the organization, people stop listening to you because you're part of the organization, they hear the same thing, you're saying the same thing over and over again. There's something of a halo effect when you bring somebody from the outside, like a competitive organization that has been successful because they're doing things in a certain way based on an insight that they've learned from a customer, and they've been able to kind of shift to better address that insight. Or even better yet, and I'll give you a specific example of SAP. We were very, very frustrated that our developers didn't, you heard Hasso talk about frustration about the ease of use and the user experience of SAP. We kept talking about that, but the developers saying, no, we got to get these features right. Yeah, but people can't use it because they can't even find your feature. No, we got to get the features right. I think the most impactful thing was we had this big developer conference, and you imagine 30,000 people sitting in a hockey stadium, and we kick off it's called the development kickoff every single year. And we actually used the opportunity, where's Jörn? We invited our biggest customer, our oldest customer, and we invited one of the customers on stage. And he did not hold back, and he just talked about this is unacceptable, you're forcing, and he actually showed examples. He put screens and said, how can you expect this, this, and this? And you had all the engineers in the room. And I think that was the most of, I'd been saying the same thing over and over and over again, but after that, people came up to me, they said, we are embarrassed, we need to do better. So that bringing people from the outside, bringing customers from the outside, sometimes that helps you break through to your engineers.
That's actually a good tip.
May I add something?
Of course, yeah.
So IBM contracted Forrester to do an independent financial assessment on their design thinking practice. So it's also a neat trick to get outsiders in to come and mark your homework and show some hard numbers, actually.
Yeah. I'm going to take two final ones. One here, and there was one there already. The rest of you are going to have to grab them during tea, I'm afraid, and ask the question. So if you can just give it.
Do you want to do the online one first?
Why not?
Thank you. I'm representing them. So the question here was, people sometimes see this as yet another fad. What is your view of introducing design thinking by stealth, by enabling collaborative environment, prompting the right questions, but without the design thinking language? It's not directed at anyone in particular.
Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to take that. In fact, that's the approach that we adopted, both in SAP and in Sanlam. You only talk about design thinking when people are going through a program and they are going through training. Other than that, you talk about the principles. It's a different way of working. And that's what works better. It creates the context, people can relate with it, they don't see it as something separate, they don't see it as something theoretical or complex. So yes, it is true, the best way.
If you can hand the microphone to George.
Hi everyone, it's good to be here and to see you all. Thank you for the conversation. Sam, I think it might have been a while, many years ago, we were having a conversation. You showed a slide of your SAP experience. It was like this, up and like huge highs and huge lows. So I think it could be for any of you. Like at your lowest moment, like what got you through?
Good one.
I'll just set the stage and you can answer. At the last Decon Festival in Potsdam, I showed a slide, and you know, one of the techniques is you do a journey map of somebody's experience, and you show the highs and lows, and the highs, you know, you amplify the lows are opportunities for innovation. I did that on my own kind of 10-year experience of trying to drive design thinking at SAP, the highs and lows. So that was the context, and I think one common thing that happens across is, you know, you talk about the executive sponsor, how important it is, but what happens when your executive sponsor, you know, leaves, changes position, and all of a sudden you don't have that executive sponsor, right? That for me was like, okay, have we done enough so that, you know, this will survive even without the same executive support?
So at your low, what got you out of that low?
Seeing that, yeah, there was enough support in the organization and being able to, you know, hey, it wasn't just because this executive was sponsoring it.
And for you, Jeanett?
For me, when I look at the SAP time, it was the holistic approach, taking into consideration the needs of the various stakeholders and not telling.
Okay. And for you, Paul?
Intrinsic motivation, so feeling a sense that you're very committed to the work, and yeah, I think that's definitely what's got me through. But yeah, I've prematurely aged for sure. There have been lots of lows, but yeah.
All right. And our final question.
Thank you. Just a quick question to Sam. Your framework, I don't know what it's called, the Lonely Soldier one, is absolutely intriguing. I just want to know if it's written up, documented anywhere. I definitely can. It resonates kind of on this trying to create an innovation journey in a big organization. So I'm interested to know if it's written up anywhere or we can find it anywhere online.
And if it isn't, when are you writing it?
Absolutely. And I think it would be great. And the other thing is, I wanted to ask, I like the concept of introducing design thinking through the focus on principles and really what the organization wants to achieve in terms of its purpose linking to values. But what I would like to ask is, in any of your settings, was there any other tools and methodologies that also encourage creativity and innovation that was kind of playing in the space at the same time? Design thinking or not, you know, other problem-solving techniques. You mentioned Six Sigma. You know, there's obviously some other things that's also floating around. And so I want to know if at any time were there other kind of tools that was also being used in the organization for a similar purpose to encourage creativity, problem-solving, innovation, and how did the design thinking kind of fit into that bigger ecosystem?
I'll just quickly answer the first part. I haven't published anything since my PhD, so no publications anywhere, but I do want to give credit to colleagues, Moritz and my colleague Janaki Kumar I mentioned before. You know, it was their work that kind of allowed us to identify the patterns for the framework. And I think, you know, like organizational psychology, you know, change management, you know, those are I think the more important things to actually drive this kind of change in the organization.
Yeah, certainly there's, the Lean Startup has been quite influential, and subsequently the Startup Way by Eric Ries. I think Jean was mentioning, you know, the design of experiments is an art in its own right. So that's something that we found useful. Design thinking excellent for making sure that you're of service and that you're other-centered and that you're keeping that mindset alive.